All right, so we're diving into something today that you've probably never heard of, but it's had a huge key impact on the world, like especially in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's called the Clean Break Plan.
Hmm. I'm intrigued already.
Right. So picture this, a plan written almost 30 years ago for Benjamin Netanyahu.
He was the Israeli prime minister back then, right?
Exactly.
Wow.
And this plan was all about like completely reshaping the Middle East.
That's a pretty tall order.
It is. It's basically a blueprint for a total geopolitical shakeup.
Okay, so who came up with this plan?
The main authors were these guys, Richard Polo, Douglas Faith, and David Wormser.
Those names ring a bell? Weren't they all about that neoconservative ideology?
Yeah, they were big proponents of it.
So for those of us who don't speak fluent political theory, what does that even mean?
Well, basically, they were all about projecting American power on the world stage,
Yeah.
and they weren't afraid to use military force to get what they wanted.
So not exactly a peace and love kind of plan then.
No, not really. The clean break was much more about taking a hardline stance, especially when it came to Israel's security and like being dominant in the region.
And which countries were they focused on?
They had their sights set on three major players: Iraq, Syria, and Iran.
Okay, let's start with Iraq then. What did this plan have to say about Saddam Hussein?
Their goal was pretty straightforward: get rid of him. They saw him as a massive threat to Israel and thought that taking him out would weaken anyone else who opposed Israel.
Wow, and did they really think they could actually pull that off?
Well, if you fast forward to 2003, you see the U.S. invading Iraq. And while the invasion wasn't like a direct result of the clean break, it definitely aligned with their goals.
Isn't it interesting that both Pearl and Faith ended up working in the Bush administration at that time?
Talk about being in the right place at the right time, right?
Right, and being in those positions meant they could really push for policies that reflected that clean break vision.
So in the end, the U.S. invasion did lead to Saddam Hussein's removal from power.
So it seems like a win for the clean break plan on the surface. But I'm guessing it wasn't all that simple.
You're right. Things are rarely simple when it comes to geopolitics.
Exactly.
So after the invasion, things got pretty chaotic. Iraq basically spiraled into instability, and that created a power vacuum, which allowed groups like ISIS to gain a foothold.
Ah, so that's how ISIS came into the picture.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So while the clean break got rid of Saddam, it also accidentally destabilized the whole region.
Classic example of unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Iraq was kind of a mixed bag for the clean break, folks. What about Syria? How did their plan impact Bashar al-Assad's regime?
Well, the Syrian civil war, which started in 2011, gave them another chance to push their clean break agenda.
And that plan was all about weakening Syria, right?
Yeah, they wanted to cut off Syria's support for groups like Hezbollah and break up their alliance with Iran.
I see. And the U.S., along with some of their buddies in the region, jumped right into that conflict, didn't they?
They did. The U.S., Jordan, Turkey, and even Saudi Arabia were all backing various groups who were fighting against Assad.
So they were basically trying to do in Syria what they did in Iraq.
To some extent, yeah. Their aim was to weaken Assad, disrupt his alliances with Iran and Hezbollah, and maybe even remove him from power altogether.
Which, if I remember correctly, they eventually did in 2024.
Yeah, that's right. It took years of conflict and a lot of international maneuvering, but in the end, they did succeed in undermining Assad.
But I bet there were some pretty big consequences that came with that success.
You bet. Just like in Iraq, there were some pretty hefty downsides.
Let me guess, more unintended consequences.
You got it. The Syrian civil war was incredibly destructive. It led to tons of deaths and millions of people being displaced.
Wow.
And even with Assad gone, Syria is still super unstable, and the long-term effects of all that intervention are still playing out.
So both Iraq and Syria were impacted by the clean break with a mix of intended and unintended consequences.
Yeah.
But what about Iran? Did they manage to topple that regime too?
Well, Iran turned out to be a much tougher nut to crack. Despite years of sanctions, cyber attacks, and support for opposition groups, the Iranian regime is still standing.
So that's where the clean break's ambitions hit a wall.
It seems that way, at least for now.
I'm curious, why do you think Iran was able to handle the pressure when Iraq and Syria couldn't?
Well, Iran is a much bigger and more powerful country than either Iraq or Syria, and they've got a long history of resisting outside pressure. They're not an easy regime to take down.
So we've got the U.S. heavily involved, pushing for regime change and reshaping alliances in the Middle East, all based on this decades-old plan. But they weren't working alone, were they?
Nope, not at all. Israel, the country the clean break was designed to benefit, was very active in making the plan happen.
Which makes sense. The whole thing was created with their security in mind. But what about the other players? Who else got pulled into this geopolitical game?
Well, Jordan played a big part, especially when it came to supporting opposition groups and sharing intelligence. Turkey was a bit more complicated since they had their own interests in the region, but they were definitely involved in efforts to weaken Assad in Syria.
And where did Saudi Arabia fit into all this?
Saudi Arabia, with its longtime rivalry with Iran, was a natural partner for this kind of thing. They provided a lot of financial and political support to any groups that opposed Iranian influence in the region.
So we've got a whole bunch of characters here, each with their own motivations and agendas, all tied together by this clean break plan. It sounds like a real-life geopolitical thriller.
It really does. And as you can imagine, the fallout from this plan has been massive. It's impacted not just the Middle East, but the whole world.
We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still so much more to unpack. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into the clean break plan and explore its lasting impact on the world.
You know, it's pretty wild to think how this one plan, the clean break, set off like a chain reaction that totally reshaped the Middle East.
It's like those Dominator videos only. Instead of little plastic tiles, it's like whole countries and millions of people.
Right. And it wasn't just those countries we talked about, like Iraq, Syria, and Iran. It messed up the whole geopolitical game, like shifting alliances and creating all these new power struggles.
So what kind of shakeups are we talking about here?
Well, for one thing, it really tested those long-standing relationships between the U.S. and its allies in the region. Like, think about the U.S. and Turkey, for example. They were allies for ages, but the clean break really messed things up between them.
Because Turkey didn't always agree with how the U.S. was handling things in the Middle East.
Exactly. Turkey had its own stuff to worry about, especially when it came to the Kurds, and those interests often clashed with what the U.S. was trying to do.
Gotcha. But on the other hand, you saw closer ties between the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, they all saw Iran as like a common enemy, so it made sense for them to team up.
So in a way, the clean break helped create this new power group focused on keeping Iran in check.
Exactly.
It's amazing how a single document written years ago could have such a big impact on relationships between countries.
It shows you the power of ideas and how they can actually be put into action, especially when you have powerful countries like the U.S. supporting them.
But the clean break didn't just rearrange the alliances, did it? It actually fueled the conflicts we've been talking about.
Absolutely. The whole idea of using military force and regime change to reshape the Middle East, well, that just made the region more unstable and volatile.
Like we saw in Iraq and Syria. Those wars had complicated beginnings, sure, but there's no doubt that the clean break's vision played a big part in how things turned out.
And the human cost of those conflicts was devastating. Millions of people forced from their homes, countless lives lost, and entire societies destroyed.
Yeah, it's tough to look at what happened after those wars and say, mission accomplished.
It is. That's the real problem here. The clean break might have had some wins, like removing Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad, but whether it was successful overall is definitely debatable.
So they might have taken out a few key players, but the game itself became way more complicated.
Exactly. Some people even argue that all that instability actually made Iran stronger in the long run, which is the opposite of what the clean break wanted.
It's like they accidentally helped their enemy. That's ironic.
It is. The clean break is a perfect example of how even the best plans can seriously backfire. You got to think about those unintended consequences.
So it makes you wonder, was this whole strategy of using military force to change regimes really the right way to go? Was there a better option?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's a debate that's still going on today among policymakers and analysts. Some people say that the main ideas behind the clean break were good, even if the execution was flawed.
So what were they trying to do, even if they went about it the wrong way?
Their whole idea was that you have to directly confront hostile regimes and push for democracy, even if it means using force. They thought that was the only way to make the region stable and safe.
But I bet some people would say that's just asking for trouble.
Absolutely. There's another school of thought that says the clean break's interventionist approach only made things worse,
I see.
that it fueled extremism and created more problems than it solved.
They'd probably point to groups like ISIS and all the instability in the region as proof that the clean break backfired.
Exactly. They'd argue that a more diplomatic approach would have been better, like one that involved working with lots of countries and addressing the root causes of conflict.
So at the end of the day, the clean break's legacy is kind of a mixed bag full of successes and failures, intentional outcomes, and unintended consequences.
That's a good way to put it. The clean break, even after all these years, is still controversial and makes people think it's a really interesting case study in foreign policy.